Well, thank you, and good morning. It's a privilege to have this opportunity to share with you today on the topic of moral injury. The topic is near to my heart. It is what I've studied and researched because I've just experienced so much loss that I attribute it to moral injury. While in combat, we saw a lot of casualties of war, but since being stateside, the number of suicides is just truly heartbreaking. And a person living with moral injury is horrible enough. It's a daily suffering, but I believe it's also a leading cause of suicide. I want to start by going over some definitions. So, the VA psychologist Dr. Jonathan Shea began his research on PTSD in the 1970s. He's probably best known for his books Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America. When he compared the results of warfare of ancient myths to modern warfare stories, he noticed of the similarities, and he demonstrated it has been a long journey for us to understand the complexities of the fallout from war. He recognized a component that was associated but distinct from PTSD, which he termed moral injury. And his research involved Vietnam veterans who you probably know carried a heavy load of shame from our society, but also from within themselves. Many of them felt forced to commit atrocities against their values and for a government and society that betrayed them. I think people, though, in general, we all understand that war is horrific and it comes with a cost, that it's traumatic for every soul that's involved, not just for the military, but for a lot of civilians and in the world, even. However, I think this was the first time that the examination of how morality of war impacts the person and the person who's doing the fighting. My impression is that previously societies just accepted it. We talked about shell shock and other things that described PSD, but nobody really engaged in the topic. And a lot of times it was just glossed over with a heavy dose of stoicism. And that's still a heavy practice today, as the military says, suck it up and move on. From my experience talking with veterans from all different conflicts, there's a sense of betrayal from the government, from higher leadership, from organic unit leadership, from peers in the ranks, from themselves. So a betrayal of what is right and wrong, actions of injustice, serves as one of the underlying causes of moral injury. Another VA psychiatrist, Dr. Brent Litz, came out with an expanded definition. He addressed the causes of combatant moral injury. It's a violation of worldview assumptions of what's right and wrong that stems from perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witnesses to acts that we would define as moral, moralist injury event. So I'm wondering, is everybody seeing the PowerPoint screen?
Yeah, we're seeing your slide presentation.
Okay. My computer was doing some funny things, so I just wanted to verify.
Yeah, we're
So
seeing your slide.
allow me to give some examples of morally injurious events that goes along with Dr. Litz's three causes. So perpetrating doesn't need much explanation. You might think of the soldier who kills or injures the enemy or civilians with the intent to survive, or the gunner who shoots a car that's full of children because the driver's tailgating the military vehicle and won't back off, or the young lieutenant who's deciphering intel, who has to make the decision on who's the bad guy, who has to be targeted for capture or elimination. And I think, in case you didn't know it or understand this, there always has to be a bad guy to pursue for a mission to take place. And in the military, there always has to be a mission. So that puts a lot of stress on young men and women. Next is the person who fails to prevent a morally injurious event. You might think of the person who goes along with what he or they are being directed to do without standing up. He doesn't actually do the morally questionable action, but he allows it. Perhaps he doesn't just allow it, perhaps he enjoys it. There's satisfaction in watching the enemy suffer. Perhaps another example of this is the medic who fails to prevent a death. You know, the doc has one job that he trains and trains for, and that is to save lives, particularly of those of his squad, his band of brothers. The medic fails to do this, to save a life, even though logic says that it might be an impossible task to save someone who's severely injured. The medic is overcome with moral pain. And the last one is bearing witness. Soldiers seeing the aftermath of an attack, maybe body remains that are obliterated or burned, cleaning vehicles that once housed, soldiers, being with a soldier, a service member who's dying in the moment, maybe witnessing civilians who are severely injured, particularly horribly maimed children, right? So those being witnesses of it can be traumatizing as well. So, the world is full of examples of morally injurious events. It's not just on the battlefield. I'm sure you have your own stories of how you've experienced morally injurious events in your own life. We all experience them to one degree or another. One category that is not on the list, because both Dr. Ritz and Dr. Shea are, really focused on combat related, would be, I would add on there, assaults, people who are victims. As you know, a ton of victims blame themselves, and their PTSD and moral injury are tightly interwoven. And this is especially true when it was a person of authority, a person whom they should have been able to trust, going back to that band of brothers. Now, Dr. Rita Brock, she came up with another definition or another way to describe it in her book, Soul Repair. And Dr. Rita Brock, so she works at the Shea Moral Injury Center. And she had this to say, that moral injury is a response to trauma. When a person's existing core moral foundations are unable to justify, process, and integrate trauma into a reliable identity and meaning system that sustains relationships and human flourishing. It touches on how individuals get stuck in the quagmire of demoralization, which disrupts a person's sense of meaning and diminishes their human flourishing. As human beings, our minds work by framework and structure. Our moral worldview is part of that concept and how the world should work. Good people do good things and they receive good outcomes. Bad people do bad things and they should receive bad outcomes, right? That's how the world should work. And we have all kinds of axioms that, support this belief system that many of us have. We reap what we sow. Karma returns to us depending on how we live our life. We will get our just rewards. God protects his people, and they shouldn't be harmed. So when bad things happen to good people, this can fracture their assumptions of how the world really does work. Though we each know that life isn't fair, and we know that life comes with hardships, a morally injurious event cuts us deep to the quick and breaks all the rules that we thought should work. A person experiencing this might think to themselves, why did I deserve this evil to happen to me? Or how, I must have done something horribly wrong and I'm being punished. So, this slide presents a matrix of how fear, loss, and moral injury are similar yet distinct. The symptoms might appear the same, with some sharing and overlapping, but the causes and hopeful interventions are different. One person might have all three, or only one of the three. But one thing is true: the humans are complex and often very messy. Notice that all three of these categories have a rebuilding need. Fear, that needs a new sense of safety. Loss requires a new worldview. Perhaps you've heard the phrase a new normal. Moral injury also has a need, and that need is forgiveness. And by forgiveness, I'm not really referring to the crying over spilt milk type of forgiveness. But it's a type of forgiveness that involves letting go of chiseled monuments in the soul. So, so you can see how overwhelming this might be for a person who's experiencing all three categories in a complex response to a morally injurious event. This might come to you as a surprise, but we all experience moral offenses in our lives. There are times in which we see, we experience, or we do injustice or breaking of some type of moral code. Moral pain should follow a morally injurious event. Our emotions are there to serve a purpose. To feel moral pain, such as guilt and shame, is actually healthy. If you've done something morally questionable, then you probably felt a little shame or guilt. And that means you have a conscience and that you care about your values. Because I don't think nobody wants to be accused of being a sociopath. But moral emotions might include shame, disgust, contempt, anger, guilt, and even fear. But not all moral pain develops into moral injury. Just like a person who has experienced trauma will have trauma responses, but it doesn't necessarily develop into PTSD. So exposure to a morally injurious event does not automatically, develop into a moral injury. When moral pain doesn't diminish over time, it risks developing into moral injury as it corrupts a person's foundational concepts of the world and themselves. Moral injury can be described as when a person experiences moral pain associated with the trauma injurious event, which elicits moral pain. We commonly call them triggers. So oftentimes people have had the moral pain for a long time, and it's been eroding at their social and psychological and spiritual well being. A person has waged war against experiencing those associated unpleasant reactions in attempts to manage and control, cope, and avoid the experience of moral pain. And this often means avoiding all facets of what we would consider vital and important. Painful reactions associated with a morally injurious event, often subconsciously, steers a person away from having healthy healthy relationships in the home, with partners, with children, with parents, with coworkers, with bosses, with community organizations, even with other veterans and faith communities. And then an openness to connecting with a higher power, or what I like to describe as a source of life. This can be faith benefits, beliefs. It can be faith beliefs, family, friends, general socialization, recreation, hobbies, going outside of their refuge in general, experiencing life nurturing practices. Sometimes it can be hard to understand how healthy, even happy practices can be avoided because they elicit those moral pain, particularly shame and guilt. They are not going to engage in relationships if they feel confronted with these painful emotions. Often, when a person has become so demoralized, their sources of meaning has lost their worth. Therefore, they experience a deep pain and a sense of that lostness, of that disconnection. So they avoid it. Life becomes meaningless, purposeless. And because of that, they often come across as confrontational. So this may create a sense of hopelessness and fatalism in its own version of perpetual suffering. They exhaust all manners of self medication after going through substances and relationships and risky behaviors, isolation, until finally there is a termination of self care. So, briefly here are some common phrases or concepts that are heard from people experiencing moral injury. These comments demonstrate how their view of themselves and the world cannot be trusted. They internalize beliefs that come from trying to make sense of a morally injurious event, which has plowed over their worldview assumptions. I want to give you a moment to read these. A person may think to himself, I injured another person. I am therefore a horrible person, especially if they feel like they've betrayed that other person, a sense of unfaithfulness. If people knew what I have done, they would reject me. They would hate me. I have failed God and my family. I don't deserve to be loved or accepted. And one that I hear often is it goes along with not deserving to be loved, but I am cursed. Or, in other words, I am damned. They might see the world and themselves through a tiny pinhole, and nothing else matters. They are oblivious to the fact that in reality, they have a loving family, they have friends who care, they have a beautiful world that is around them. But reality is beyond their perception because they are under the belief that everything is untrustworthy. So there's been a significant amount of research completed in the last decade, especially on moral injury. And this would include using popular modalities such as cognitive behavior therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy, adaptive disclosure therapy. There's been research addressing the spiritual dimension of moral injury, such as the evidence based model of building spiritual strength, which was developed by a VA psychologist. Then there are studies engaging within certain faith tradition framework, which normally focuses on the forgiveness process. So evidence based practices are important. And I think that it's beneficial to remember that individuals respond to treatment when it's the right time, more than with the right modality. For an example, you can try the same modality several times with the same person, but when it's the right time, they become open to it and they engage in the process. But different people respond to modalities differently because we are all individuals. I want to primarily highlight two practices. The first being building spiritual strengths, which was developed by Dr. Irene Harris, a VA senior psychologist at the VA Mental Illness Research, Education, and Clinical Center, MERIC. Building spiritual strength has been demonstrated in two RCTs. This is a manual based group therapy that is intended to be delivered within a faith context. It addresses the participants' understanding of their individual spirituality and not really a specific faith. So it's all about healing from the trauma and reconnecting or rebuilding, finding a spirituality that works for them. So, building spiritual strength was designed to relieve the moral injury or spiritual distress that's associated with PTSD. The intervention is designed to be administered by a team consisting of a mental health provider and a chaplain, both with training on the program. I've led numerous of these groups, and each time people have come alive and they begin the healing journey of reconnection. And I want to stress that, like a lot of things in recovery, it is a journey. So nothing happens immediately. It takes patience and time and work. The second evidence based practice that I find helpful for moral injury is acceptance and commitment therapy. By no means am I some expert in ACT, but I do find that it is helpful. And I wanted to share some concepts that relate to moral injury and its recovery. So ACT utilizes mindfulness to create space in individuals whose minds are typically squeezed and focused on those certain thoughts. Their worldview has really shrunk down. So ACT attempts to make room for feelings and sensations and urges and allows them to come and go without fighting or running. ACT facilitates being aware of the present, focusing on what is happening now, not in the past or in the future. Diffusion, recognizing thoughts, images, and memories for what they are, allowing them to come and go as they will, without fighting or running. Facilitates recognition that thoughts, feelings, memories, sensations, images, roles, or physical body, they do not define who we are. They are part of who we are as a whole. So ACT emphasizes that we are a being who has experiences, not beings who are the experiences. Oftentimes, trauma gets infused with moral judgment and becomes a defining point in a person's life. For example, I made a bad choice, but my whole being is more than that one choice, would be how ACT would want to um, view it. It emphasizes that thoughts are just thoughts and not facts. Same for emotions. Committed action to values that support a person's beliefs and meanings. It nurtures space to grow self-loving kindness, to facilitate allowance of flexibility that previously was rigid and in a tight psychological mind and heart space. Once space has been created, hope can be imagined. I think that's so powerful. That once space has been created, once the expansion has happened and perception is clearer, hope can be imagined. Hope can be realized. Mindfulness is employed to assist the participant to expand their mental space, which facilitates acceptance of pain and letting the pain be without trying to avoid it, without trying to fix it, without trying to fight it or run away. Moving towards meaningful values without trying to express the pain. The goal isn't to reduce symptoms, but is about living out values, which facilitates moral healing. Healing has the potential to reduce symptoms. As I mentioned before, so this doesn't occur immediately. It's kind of like turning around the Titanic. These individuals have not engaged in their values in perhaps a very long time, because those values is what's causing the moral pain. They didn't work before. How are they going to work now? It's hard for them to re-engage. But moving towards these values cultivates a sense of meaning and purpose. The theory is that the more intentional the commitment to a value-based lifestyle, the more they will flourish. So this creates movement within themselves towards openness, with increased sense of possibilities, towards greater openness to relationships with significant others, with family, with children, with friends, right? With bosses and coworkers, towards doing recreational, or what I like to say recreational activities that they had stopped doing. They if they've been running for so long, they have forgotten how the things that they used to do have brought them happiness. And moving towards spirituality to identify meaning and connection, such as with a higher power or a tradition, or I mentioned earlier, a source of life. This might include discovering a new tradition or new practices or a new perspective that bolsters that person's connections with meaning in the world and meaning for themselves. So the pain remains because the pain reflects its importance to the person's values and should not be discounted or but honored. But the person is engaging in life once again and finding meaning in the world and themselves. And this is a very much step by step process. And now I'll open it up to any questions out there. Not that I have all the answers.
I don't have any questions from anybody here attending in person. Do we have any questions from anybody that is attending virtually? Feel free to open up the chat right there. And
You need to check in the questions.
oh no, I can ask them.
Are there any cases where able folks may be correlated with it?
We have a question here, Doctor, from the audience here in Tucson, in person, asking if there are any cases where folks are able, absent without leave, that are correlated with any type of moral injury that you're aware of.
For example, like that.
Yeah.
Specific, like, an example, the gentleman, the soldier that crossed the border in North Korea, wondering what type of moral injuries, if any, that may bring.
So it's very individualistic. What one moral interest event will have a response in one person will be totally different with another person. So some people do have a higher threshold of um, resiliency. Does that answer the question?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, if it's individual, if it's individualized.
Yeah, if it's individualized, then definitely, yeah, it's answering the question, because it's like you're saying, it's specific to each person, so yeah.
And then there's a cultural factor.
Correct, and they're also speaking about like the cultural factor coming into that as well for the moral injury.
Oh, most definitely. So we have, our family values, we have cultural values, we have faith tradition values, and we have our own values too. And all those go towards uh, framing how we see the world.
I see a question in the chat popping up. It says, what are some good and effective ways or means to accept pain?
The process of acceptance.
Correct, acceptance of pain, any good or effective ways or means to accept it.
That's a part that mindfulness really plays a part in being able to, they learned skill, the learned practice, and of just being present and not judging the pain, whether it's psychological or physical, as being bad or good, just being with it. And there's different mindfulness practices that do facilitate lessening physical pain.